Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Bipartisan Policy Center for the fifth webinar in our series, Getting Serious About Housing Supply, which is intended to examine some of the various facets of the acute shortage of safe, decent, and affordable homes in the United States, and explore promising solutions to fix it. I'm Andy Winkler, the director of our Housing and Infrastructure Project, and I help in leading the work of BPC's J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. The center was founded last fall to advance the goal of a safe, decent, and affordable home for every American family, recognizing that housing is so much more than shelter. It provides really significant social and economic benefits to our country. Today's webinar is a little bit of a departure for us in that we're focusing more or exclusively kind of on how the private sector, as opposed to policymakers, can help in boosting housing affordability. And what we hear all the time is that the housing supply challenge is just so profound that businesses of all shapes and sizes are increasingly citing the lack of affordable housing as a primary barrier to attracting, retaining, and developing really diverse and productive workforces, which I think you'll hear from some of today's participants. Housing is also such a critical factor guiding where companies decide to locate their operations, where workers search for jobs in such a really competitive labor market. So without further ado, I want to take a minute and quickly introduce today's participants. I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Amazon's David Swift. He is a policy and data project manager for Amazon's Housing Equity Fund and pinch hitting today for Catherine Buell. Thank you, David, for being here. Next, we have Eileen Fitzgerald. She is the head of Housing Affordability Philanthropy at Wells Fargo. And as an aside, is an incredibly thoughtful member of BPC's Housing Council, which was launched last year to develop and advance bipartisan policies to help close key racial and ethnic disparities in housing. Thanks, Eileen. And then finally, we have Dr. Sally Kraft, who serves as Vice President of Population Health at Dartmouth Health, which is an incredibly well-respected and innovative system of community hospitals, clinics, healthcare services, which serve communities across New Hampshire and Vermont. Thank you, Dr. Kraft. So before I jump into some of my prepared questions, I wanted to remind everybody watching today live to please submit any questions you have at any time. So you can post them in the chat if you're watching on YouTube, or tweet them to @BPC_bipartisan, or using hashtag BPC Live. We have some time reserved at the end for all of your questions, but I'll also hop in if there's sort of a clarifying question that you have. So I thought, just to get us started, I would love to take a few minutes for each of you to talk about how you and your companies are getting involved in housing. We've seen so many companies, large companies like Apple and Microsoft, to a recent article about Disney, moving far beyond kind of what we think is the ways that companies get involved in housing, like the occasionally very generous employer-assisted housing program. We're seeing companies investing directly in new housing developments, all the way to launching kind of big advocacy campaigns for more durable policy change around housing affordability. So I thought, to kick us off, maybe David, you could share a little bit of the context on how Amazon's Housing Equity Fund came about. What are the commitments it is making and has made, and what you hope to achieve with it?
Sure. Thank you very much for the introduction. David Swift. I'm a senior policy and data analyst or policy manager for Amazon's Housing Equity Fund. The fund was started just over 14 months ago when we moved into announced our move to the HQ2 location in Arlington. We have the goal of, over the next 5 years, providing more than $2 billion in funding in loans and grants to support at least 20,000 units. We are focused in the Puget Sound, Washington, D.C., MSA, and Nashville area through what we call our hometown communities. We've been in operation just over a year, and we've provided money for $1.2 billion on over 8,000 affordable units. We're very proud of the success we've had really in our first full year. And we've been very active in the communities we serve. My role is helping along the data and providing analytics in the decision-making process, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, David. Maybe I'll turn it over now to Eileen. Since Wells is one of the nation's largest mortgage lenders, you clearly have a little bit of a different perspective and more expertise in all things housing. But I would love for you to similarly share a little bit about the company's sort of evolution in its philanthropic strategy towards housing affordability, which I know you are a key part of in coming to the position not so long ago. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you already and hope to achieve in your position with Wells Fargo's foundation.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me here today. I'm so excited that the BPC is kind of focused on this on the supply topic, obviously, but also on the role of corporate engagement. So Wells Fargo is one of the nation's largest homeownership lenders and actually one of the nation's largest rental lenders and investors. So this is part of our core business. But in addition, in 2019, Wells Fargo made a $1 billion commitment to housing affordability philanthropy, which is when I joined. And before that, our housing philanthropy had really focused on homeownership, which obviously is a great thing. But in 2019, the company realized that we really had to look at housing across the economic spectrum, and that the housing affordability crisis was so significant, and sadly, has not really improved in that front, that it was important to think about the power and value of stable, affordable, quality housing, again, across that spectrum. People don't become homeowners if they're paying 70% of their income for rent, right? So we think it's key for economic advancement. And just quickly, so what we focus on in our philanthropy are 4 key strategies. One is to increase supply of quality, affordable rental and homeownership homes. Expand homeownership opportunities, especially for people of color who have historically been cut out. The third is increasing housing stability, which was incredibly important and is still as we went into the pandemic. And I think, non-housers became aware of how critical it was to have, in a pandemic, a safe, affordable place to live. And then finally, supporting transformation innovation. And that can be, policy, peer networking, practices, kind of breakthrough ideas, knowing that we can't keep doing this the same way we're doing it. So across that, we really are trying to kind of move the needle in our philanthropy and then, through our lending and investments.
Great. Thanks, Eileen. And then Dr. Kraft, Dartmouth Health has engaged the issue of housing affordability, as we've talked about on kind of 2 fronts. On the one hand, housing is such a key determinant of health for the patients that you serve. But I think you have a particularly unique story in that the lack of affordable housing in New Hampshire and Vermont and the communities that you serve, which are largely small and rural, have also directly affected your business and your ability to bring in top talent, healthcare workers where there are shortages all over the country. It's particularly hard when you can't house them. So maybe you could walk us through sort of the housing supply challenges that you all have seen in the communities that you serve and how you are approaching, both issues.
Great. Thank you, Andy. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'd like to actually frame this discussion by letting people know that Dartmouth Health is a health system located in Vermont and New Hampshire. Our physical addresses are in both. We have hospitals and clinics in both. And I don't know how many of you have been to Vermont and New Hampshire, but beautiful, beautiful states. largely rural, and many of the communities that we either have our workforce living in or we are serving patients from are very small, communities of less than 5,000. So we have a very rural footprint. And I'm going to spend a lot of my time today talking about our experience at our academic medical center, the Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, which is located in Lebanon, New Hampshire. So we have a very large geographic area, which is rural, as I mentioned. And we actually have a true housing crisis in this area. We refer to the area as the Upper Valley. It's municipalities that straddle the Connecticut River. We don't have enough housing, and we don't have enough affordable housing. And so we have been engaged in housing from really 3 different perspectives, and I'll outline those and talk a little bit about what we've done, and then look forward to additional questions and discussion. If you think about 3 concentric circles, we're a health system and we take care of patients. And in order for our patients to be as healthy as possible, we know that they need to have access to safe, affordable, and stable housing. And that it is really, we know that people who are homeless die, lose years of life, they die prematurely, that people have housing insecurity, have higher rates of chronic disease, of mental health disease, substance use disorders, depression, and that unsafe housing has risks as well. Exposure to lead paint, molds that can lead to respiratory problems, etc. So our first focus has been on how do we optimize housing for our patients. And we've done several direct investments with community organizations. We've partnered with community organizations to understand how best to provide support for supportive housing, and have looked into innovative ways to create housing for specific patient populations. In particular, most recently focusing on pregnant or young mothers with children who are suffering from substance use disorders. So that's that inner circle. The second circle is our healthcare workforce that you were referring to, Andy. We are the largest private employer in the state of New Hampshire, and in our rural area up here in what we refer to as the Upper Valley, we employ about 8,500 folks in our medical center up here. And we have 1,900 vacancies currently, which is really astounding. And it's the highest that it's ever been in the history of those who are here now. And one of the reasons we have so many vacancies is we have a lack of access to affordable housing in our immediate area around the academic medical center. That makes a difference on health, because if we can't staff our beds with workforce, or if we can't hire people to work in environmental services to turn the rooms around quickly so we can move patients in and out, or we can't accept referrals from outside hospitals that are calling and asking for the specialized services that only we can offer in this area, it has a direct impact on people's health. They can't get in and they can't get the services that they need. So we've got our patients, we have our workforce housing, and we have been engaged in creating a community loan fund in order to help spur that investment that needs to be made in local housing. And we can talk in more detail about that. But that third sphere, that third concentric ring around our work is that of the communities. And we know that communities that have poor housing, low employment opportunities, communities in which the populations don't have access to adequate education have worse health. Those communities have premature death, higher rates of chronic disease, and higher costs related to increased health service utilization. In fact, we have an aphorism that your zip code matters more to your health than your genetic code. So we know that we as a health system need to learn how to be investors in housing for communities, even if it's not our workforce or our patients, because that's how we can create healthy communities in our region. And we have made commitments and investments for the last several years in a community development fund called the New Hampshire Community Loan Foundation. And again, we can talk about that in more detail after we get through introductory remarks. But I think that framework of our patients, our workforce, our people, and our communities is a framework that we've used to really address the different housing investments and activities that we've been involved with.
No, that's super helpful, Sally. Thank you so much. And that raises one question for me, which is, as you have gotten into this space, how do you really decide where your resources are best used? And so there was a question, I think, in the YouTube chat about, for David, kind of where Amazon is allocating and deciding to allocate some of the funds it has set aside. But maybe each of you can kind of talk through, how you're deciding to make these investments, and in particular for David and Sally, how institutions that are not as, housing versed as Wells Fargo are kind of building up the capacity to make these decisions and decide where, both philanthropic dollars, but also some non-philanthropic dollars can best be invested in housing. David, would you like to kick it off and kind of talk a little bit more about where the Housing Equity Fund is, how it's deciding which communities? I know you said your key centers, but are you looking at other places Amazon's involved? How are you going about choosing developments, and what's the goal?
Sure, absolutely. Again, we are focused on what we call our hometown communities of Puget Sound, the Washington, D.C., Arlington area, and then Nashville. Inside those areas, we are working with developers. I think the name equity, the word equity there, some people think it's an ownership program. It is equity in the sense of justice. We are working to help support and provide housing justice and equity for people that are usually not, who've been left out in the process often. Our goal is in that sort of 30 to 80% AMI range. We are looking at projects that have goals around either building new units or preservation of existing properties to prevent displacement of existing low-income tenants. We also have goals around transit developments. We are a big proponent of supporting mass transit and public transit uses. So we are working with all three of those markets, mass transit authorities, to build around transit hubs so that the people that live there can have easy access to work. Obviously, that's very important for not just the quality of life, but ease of work and environmental impact. We also have a goal to work with and develop BIPOC developers. We want to make sure that we're a member of the community, not just as providing funding, but helping grow people who will continue this project and continue to make help develop housing that is affordable to people across the regions they live in. So Amazon has a number of different prongs and approaches to what they're working on. The decision-making process is looking at all the different factors when a project comes in, and trying to decide how best to allocate that funds to reach the people in the most need and to support the communities of where they live. It's not just simply the number of units, but also who's bringing the project to us, nonprofit versus for-profit, and where it's located as far as the most positive impact for the community.
Got it. Dr. Kraft, did you want to follow up and talk a little bit about how you are kind of deciding which communities and where housing, what investments to get involved in, and how a health system has built up the expertise to be able to do that?
Expertise, wow.
Yes.
Let me return to those concentric circles. Our inner circle, where we're focusing on patients, we actually do look at the evidence in the literature and the research, and do our best to understand how does that evidence and research apply to our local areas. And when we don't have evidence, we actually do our best to collect data. We are an academic center, so we believe that our researchers and our ability to understand and collect data can help inform our decisions for where to make those investments, and hopefully to help inform others when we have the opportunity to present and to publish. Our workforce housing fund, the Upper Valley Loan Fund, was created really with urgency. When you think about it, if we can't bring workforce into our area and keep our beds open, we won't be able to take care of people. So that really has risen over the last couple of years to a very high priority across multiple departments at the health system. And we have been working with partners in the community, other employers in the community, to find the best community development people with whom we can engage to help teach us. We're not experts in housing, but they can help teach us how best to construct the loans that need to be put together and to create the financing mechanisms in order to make the investments in our communities. And finally, that last outer circle, the community circle that I refer to, in which your zip code matters more than your genetic code. We've been proud members of the Healthcare Anchor Network, which is a organization with 60 plus health systems across the country that have been examining their roles as anchor institutions in their communities about how best they can address housing. And we have learned a great deal from our partners in the Healthcare Anchor Network, and have organized a team back here at home at Dartmouth Health to help promote our anchor mission, which is using our usual business practices to intentionally make decisions that will result in improved health for the communities, and specifically improved health equity. And as David said, it's really, that is the opportunity for every individual to reach their fullest health potential. So we have different mechanisms across those three different concentric circles.
Great, thanks, Sally. So I wanted to turn a little bit now to Eileen. Because Wells does have, and you have already made some really significant investments, what kind of lessons have you already learned that you can provide to other institutions looking to get involved in this space? And are there any particular things that work? I think so often we have found we continue to pour out money, we continue to do things at every level of government, private sector, public sector, and we still have the worst housing crisis, housing supply situation that we've ever had. So, where are these dollars really proving impactful, and what lessons could you provide to other folks?
Sure. Well, I think the first is there is no one size fits all, and there is this spectrum. And probably I think one of the most important things is that any corporation or employer thinking about how they can engage. And, maybe if they're new to this, they engage kind of in a lighter touch and kind of grow their expertise. But as you mentioned at the start, employer assisted housing's been out there for a long time. And, for many years that meant building like awareness around financial health, or maybe bringing folks on site, or homebuyer education to down payment assistance. And now more recently, we see much more engagement on the rental housing side, and thinking about kind of the impact of corporations and employers in a community. But it's great to take whatever step you can and kind of think about your company moving along that spectrum. I think the biggest needs are kind of risk capital, because there's never enough, but to the degree that you're using a government financing program or bond financing or whatever that might be, The places that can be harder, that the pre-development costs, that you're taking a different approach, maybe using a different construction methodology. There's kind of, I thought it might be helpful just highlight, I think that kind of the 4 issues that we face across, whether you're talking about home ownership or rental, which is really people's incomes, like, and affordability, right? Can they actually, do they make enough to be able to pay a rent or a mortgage? Then there's the supply of land or buildings that can be then turned into housing. And that is, getting harder and harder as that gets constrained. There is the historic and current discrimination, and being aware of that, I think, is super important. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. And then honestly, awareness and access, things like helping employees think about their financial health, their credit score. That doesn't matter just for home ownership. It actually also matters for rental. So those are kind of 4 ways to think about the housing challenge out there. And in a civic way, certainly engaging on land use and availability and access to housing is really important. And sometimes people think about that as, their corporate responsibility, but then when they're on a local board or something else, they don't necessarily apply that. So how you help, all your employees and your senior leadership understand the housing affordability crisis, I think that makes a big difference. But specifically on capital, low cost, long term, that's like the easiest, low cost, long term makes a huge difference to housing developers and to getting out there and really being able to develop quality housing that is more affordable, whether it's, even at a workforce level. And then that risk capital, something that, doesn't either is in the form of philanthropy or if in a loan has, a high risk tolerance. That's what helps complement a lot of the other programs available to government through government and stuff that can't take, or, a lender that can only take so much risk because we're a regulated lender in how we do work.
Great, thanks, Eileen. And you raised what I think is a really kind of fundamental or threshold question about this conversation, which is, what is the expectation or the responsibility or the role of kind of corporate America in responding to issues like housing affordability, as opposed to the role served by policymakers, right? So we target these investments in such different ways, with the intention always of having them be impactful and catalytic. But maybe each of you could talk a little bit about what you see as that kind of balance. Where are you filling in to help to create new housing? But where do policymakers really need to step up? Because we can't put the expectation all on companies, many of which are only tangentially related to housing to solve our housing affordability crisis. David, did you want to kick us off and I can go around?
Sure. Very much it's Amazon's stated position that in the end, the housing crisis falls to government. It is the only entity with the resources and legal framework to solve this problem or to help point it back in the right direction. Obviously, there's an important role for corporations and other third parties to get involved and help and make a difference. But obviously, any of these companies can only work within the framework of the government. So if things like zoning laws, other changes that would make affordable housing easier to get done and provide better use of land falls on the government to take care of and local elected officials to address. Amazon and other companies can do it. They can help and be involved and provide thoughts and ideas, but we can't change the laws. That's not where we exist. So we're an important part, but in the end, it is the government's responsibility to lead the way.
Eileen or Sally?
Yeah, and I will say this is like Eileen's framing, not an official Wells Fargo stance here. So I think housing is a civic responsibility. So I wouldn't, and at the end of the day, we are all collectively the government, right? The government is elected and and appointed at some level through people. So I think that sense of civic responsibility as both a citizen and as a corporation employer is really important. I think one of the challenges with housing is the regional implications, right? So, I mean, you could take Silicon Valley for this, companies get developed out in the suburbs, people, there isn't housing out there. People are then living in a city that of a city that has necessarily no control over what development happens. So we've always struggled to, I think, as a nation, to think about regional approaches, but I think especially when you think of that corporate employer piece, people are going to live in different places, and that puts so much pressure on transportation systems and everything else. So I think that's a place that employers and corporations can be speaking up about. We do need to think about these outside, the construct of 500 square feet outside of, wherever my employer may be coming to work. So I think that's a big thing. And as I mentioned before, I think understanding, there's a great book called Color of Law by Richard Rothstein that really looks at, how do we get to essentially a lot of the systemic discrimination and segregation and so many places we are in our country in housing. And it's really important to understand where that's coming from, because even as you come to solutions and many, even many people in housing, I think, have not until very recently. So I think that's another place that corporations can step up and help educate themselves and their, in a civic mindset, their colleagues, chambers of commerce, incredibly important place to have this housing conversation.
Great, thanks, Eileen. Dr. Kraft?
Yeah, I'll say from again, a healthcare perspective, where what we're doing at our health system is creating health, not housing, but recognizing that relationship between health and housing. You can't be healthy if you don't have a safe, affordable and stable home. So when I think about what we do at the patient level, I think there's a role for our payers to help us out. There's a lot of pressure to screen for what people refer to as the social determinants of health, or the non-clinical health drivers: housing, transportation, income, etc. And if we screen for those, if I ask my patient about their housing situation, I, as a physician, want to be able to respond to that. So I need the payers who are providing health insurance to honor the fact that it takes energy to do the screening, but even more importantly, we have to be building the response systems so that when I do identify someone who I wasn't suspecting of being housing insecure and needs help, I can activate a response system and know with certainty that there'll be somewhere for them to go. So I think our payers have a opportunity to be part of this solution. I think local partnerships, again, we're a health system. I don't even understand, Eileen, some of the terminology that you use, but I can be a good partner with community, other community members, and with our Corp B bank, which is located right down the street. And we can be really good partners in coming and helping to identify and invest in solutions. And then again, at that national level or regional community level, there's a lot of power in the health system, a lot of people power who we're here to help others. But also we know that community benefits, which are our way of investing in communities and our way of demonstrating the value of our, the fact that many of us are not for profit. Not all health systems are, but certainly Dartmouth Health is. We have opportunities to take those community benefit dollars and to invest them deeply, and to have policies that help incentivize making the investments that will have the greatest return in terms of housing solutions, I think will be helpful. So I actually think there's a role for many of us to help find the solutions to the housing crisis that really faces many of our communities.
You know, Andy, I would just add, I think to Sally's point, one of the things that's happened more in the last 5 to 10 years with health and housing connection is healthcare's recognition that there are a lot of housing experts, and they reach out, you know, they're not trying to say we're going to become the developer or we're necessarily going to do all this financing. And I do think that is also helpful for other sectors to say they're, you know, very experienced, both nonprofit and for-profit housing developers. There's community development financial institutions or CDFIs that can be a great vehicle for, you know, for investments from a health system or a payer out there. So that's another thing is there's no reason to necessarily have to do it yourselves. And there is now, you know, a very good ecosystem to work through.
Just to stay on the health housing connection while we're on it, Dr. Kraft, if you wanted to build on that and kind of, because there are a lot of payers who are getting more actively involved in trying to encourage folks to screen for health instability, other health issues, hazards in the home, like asthma triggers and falls prevention, home modifications, things like that for older adults. So maybe you could just talk kind of more broadly about where those health housing linkages are heading, just as a sector, and where you think that philanthropic dollars could push it a little further, and policymakers could push it a little further.
Yeah, there is growing recognition, and boy, if we didn't know before the pandemic, we all are recognizing the relationship between housing and health, and frankly, recognizing the relationship that unless all of us are healthy, no one's safe until we're all safe, borrowing from the World Health Organization. It is really in all of our best interests to optimize housing and health for each other. Economic prosperity and health are inextricably linked. So I applaud very much the push from our payers and interested parties and having the health system ask the questions: are you safe? Do you have a stable place to live? Are you making a decision between paying your utility bill or buying nutritious food? These are really important questions to ask. What we really need is help with how do we respond to that. So here I am in a very rural area with a housing crisis, as I described. If I have no place to send someone who confesses to me and tells me, I'm living in the back of my car and it's going down to -20 tonight, that puts me and our health system in an incredibly painful position. So we need those investment dollars to help us find solutions for locally for our patients that we are serving. I think another opportunity that we've talked about is having better connections between the health system and the community. Again, we are a health system. We are not a homeless shelter. I'm not a food pantry, although I will say with pride that we have been able to put food emergency supplies in many of our clinics, but that's not my forte. My forte is how do I deliver healthcare services? So making it easy for me to make the connections between the community assets when they do exist, community coordination, information technologies, platforms that will allow me to say to the homeless shelter, I'm sending Jane Doe over to you, and to know that Jane Doe actually made it there with what we call a closed loop referral. That's an area that I think is rich for investment, and to help us all know that each of us have a really important part to play in the health solution. The housing people do, the food people do, the transportation people do, but we all need to get coordinated around the patients and the population needs in order to do that. So I think, Andy, I think there's opportunities, again, as I said, for many people to be part of these solutions.
Great, thanks, Sally. So I wanted to turn to a couple of the questions that were submitted from audience members, and please, everybody, if you have additional ones, leave them in the chat or tweet them to BBC. So one asked, and there are a couple kind of related questions, which is how can Black and other minority developers who are developing affordable housing in response to their needs garner your interest? So, you know, you've made billion-dollar commitments. How do people get on your radar? What's just the process for people who have a good idea and don't know where to go to get that kind of idea funded? Eileen, if you wanted to start.
Sure. Well, you know, we'll be announcing something to kind of expand support to strengthen Black and other minority developers. I think understanding again there's definitely been a barrier on access to capital. There's a barrier on access to networks. So how can we both as philanthropy, but also, you know, in our lending and investing, open that up kind of in a related way. We did several $100 million of financing in small business that helped strengthen mostly Black and Hispanic small businesses. Again, from that, you need to get first to a pretty decent balance sheet so you can actually participate and play. So I think there's a lot of conversation and awareness of how in real estate in particular, there's a bunch of informal barriers and kind of some very closed networks, and we're looking at how to open that. I guess taking a somewhat different take on this, there's also things like in homeownership or other ways that we can particularly target. So last week, Wells Fargo announced use of a special purpose credit refinancing tool for Black homeowners. So this is something that is allowed, it's very technical, under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And until recently, it wasn't clear if it was a violation of the Fair Housing Act to be able to say, use this in housing, and to say, because in a particular market, there's clearly been a barrier in access to capital because of discriminatory practices, or just that you know, there's a huge gap here. You can use this very specific tool. So the Secretary Fudge at HUD came out like last fall to say that that does not violate fair housing. So that's another great tool that is now out there for lenders and CDFIs to use to actually get to developers, and some have used it in small business framework as well.
Thanks, Eileen. And yeah, we're super excited about Wells' announcement on special purpose credit programs. BPC's Housing Council has done a bit of work, and back last fall, including Eileen, we penned a letter to HUD trying to ask for those clarifications. So it was really good to see the administration move on these things. And I know there is a lot of interest in special purpose credit programs. I don't know if you've already gotten any reception, but how closely will we be following its implementation, sharing some of those lessons for other folks interested in it?
Yeah, I know a lot of that, like, wow, we really want to see how this works, and hopefully we can continue to expand, and others will as well.
Great. Sally or David, did you want to pick up on that question of how people get on your radar? You know,
yeah, absolutely.
Very crudely, you've got a lot of money and people want it.
People, yes, absolutely. That is an easy question. So the Housing Equity Fund through the Amazon in the community has a site where there's an application available. All you have to do is fill out the application. Is either for developers or for people looking for grants. Amazon is incredibly flexible with how we are funding these projects. To date, it has been a mix of grants and long-term mezzanine debt, but we are very flexible. The only thing we're really not doing is equity. We're not making purchases. We are either lending or providing grants. And we have options for grants beyond just looking to fund units for people working in understanding and developing support networks or other things related to housing. We are very interested in hearing your ideas in ways that Amazon can get involved and be a good partner in your community. So please go to that site if you have either a property or a developer, or even looking for grant money. There's a place to apply on the site. We also, to support the BIPOC developer community, just in January launched what we call our accelerator program to help minority developers find projects to work on and to get mentorship and guidance in getting affordable housing projects closed. As Eileen mentioned, that there's often sort of closed groups where it can be very difficult for new developers to get into the space, and also difficult for, especially the affordable space where margins get so thin, it can be difficult to sort of build those partnerships. So Amazon has taken an active role there through our accelerator program, which is currently running with 3 cohorts, 1 in each community. And based on the feedback so far, it's very likely we'll be doing it again next year.
And Andy, as a health system, we're not exactly in the same business, but I will. The conversation does remind me that we at Dartmouth Health and many other health systems across the country are generally the largest employers in their communities. We are the anchor institutions. We're deeply rooted in the community, and no matter which way the winds blow, we'll probably always be in this community. And as anchor institutions, we look at our business practices as ways to promote health equity through our communities, through our hiring, our intentional hiring and development of labor, especially in areas that have historically been marginalized as potential employees for our organization. Just that there haven't been that many opportunities in the past, and we've actually developed a workforce readiness institute to bring those individuals into our employment. We look very intentionally at purchasing. Can we purchase supplies from BIPOC owned businesses or businesses that have boards that are committed to equity, et cetera. And then our intentional use of our investment portfolio. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we made investments into the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund to support homeowners with manufactured homes, and not only owning those manufactured homes, but owning the land underneath that, converting private manufactured or mobile park homes, the actual land to resident-owned communities, ROCs, and that very intentional use of our investment portfolio in order to promote equity throughout. So while we're in a different business, we take our anchor mission, our role as an anchor institution to heart, and try to promote equity in all of our business decisions.
Great, thanks, Sally. And we had one question in the chat that I might steer towards you from Marguerite, who asked, are there opportunities with the new infrastructure funding and remaining funding to build up selected rural areas to offer more affordable housing? There are lots of different resources, and just as you said so often, I think we think of each of these pieces in a silo, but transportation connections to housing also critically important in rural communities and for your ability to serve those communities. So maybe you could speak to other opportunities or things you're looking at beyond housing, but building those other linkages.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and it's it's actually a really exciting time to be in this space. There is a lot of federal funding that's coming with the thought of making deep investments to make our communities healthier and safer. I think investments in transportation, childcare is a huge area that needs a lot of investment. And for us in particular, in our rural area, improving our access to broadband has a direct impact on health. Look at how quickly we pivoted to telehealth during the pandemic. But really, we live in a different way. Many of us have, if we have the opportunity, have been able to do at least part of our job through remote technologies. And in our rural communities, if you don't have access to reliable broadband, that can really decrease and constrain your employment opportunities as well as access to health services. So I'm very excited with the federal funding, the state decisions to pass through federal funds and to invest from the state in many of these infrastructure pieces that in rural environments are challenging, and they will continue to be challenging. It's just that we don't have the density of population that brings that immediate return on investment. But I think these new investments that are coming, and New Hampshire just recently announced a large investment in housing. So these are encouraging times. We've passed through a dark couple of years, but I think that these are times for great hope and optimism that we'll have learned that we really need to take care of each other and to invest deeply in our communities to promote health for all.
I think you leave us on a really great point about just how much the pandemic has reminded us of the importance of housing, and for all people who have, worked, taught their kids, et cetera, from home, and how important home was. So that raises one question that I had originally, which is, how do you get companies to talk a little bit more about housing? Not even put money into new developments, but just to be more vocal advocates for, a pro-housing agenda. We see so many different companies like all of yours who are looking to make investments in communities, but are concerned about the lack of housing supply. But we so often don't hear from companies about housing. So Eileen, I know we've talked a lot about this because I would love, the Chamber of Commerce and all of America's largest corporations to be more vocal housing advocates. But maybe you could share a little bit about how we get companies more out there and talking about housing.
Yeah, and it's interesting in certain markets, like I've done several presentations to local Chamber of Commerce, and my colleagues have. And nationally, the Chamber has also done something to try to lift that. So I do think they are a really important partner. I think having employers just think about what do they understand about their employee, like simply doing a survey of, hey, how's what's your housing situation? We don't need specifics, but are you paying more than 30% of your rent? Are you commuting an hour and 45 minutes to here and what kind of burden is your housing situation putting on? I think there is not always as much awareness about that as there should be. And that can have a huge mental health toll on employees. And then obviously it's very hard to compete. And places where we see more engagement sometimes, I was thinking as you were talking about rural, like in many of the rural Colorado communities that are tourism focused, employers are finding ways to give land or engage in other ways because they literally cannot operate their businesses because people can't get there to work. So I think, understanding what's making life hard for your employees to the point that they may not be as productive would be a great way for anybody to start. And then just thinking, again, your voice can make such a difference. Housing is very local. We can have federal money that helps support things, but at the end, it's not just zoning, it's permitting, it's all of the different elements of that. And that's a place where employers and corporations have such a strong voice. So many ways to, but just find out what's happening. That's a head start.
Thanks, Eileen. I did want to ask you too, we had another question submitted in the chat. which is a little more technical. Do the properties developed by corporate funding have affordability contracts? So this is obviously something that comes up quite a lot. How long are we retaining sort of the rent restrictions or other affordability provisions in the investments you're providing? Maybe Eileen, David, Sally, you could all kind of speak to that.
I think as David, said, in most situations, virtually all probably, corporations are not developing, right? They are, they may provide land. They could do, I'm on travel in California, and we were just looking at a situation where one of the school districts is giving a 99-year ground lease for development of housing, but they're still keeping that land in the long run. So there's things like that. And sometimes in that, they might then have like, okay, we're giving you this for 99 years. We want affordability over that time. There's, employers that are doing investment in naturally occurring affordable housing and maybe giving, 20-year debt for that. That's kind of below market. It really varies by employer, but it also kind of varies a lot in the market. States are quite different and localities are different in how much they push that long-term affordability. But I don't know, and certainly in many conversations, I think there's a strong awareness that nobody's looking for a 3 or 5 year solution. So it's kind of how do you blend this money or these resources along with everything else that's required and incentivized in the market.
I will say that Amazon's requirement on almost all the transactions we've done has been over 90 years. Almost all of them have been 99 years, a couple of 98. But we have been looking for that is one of the most important determining factors is providing long-term affordability in the range of 90 plus years.
And I can say that from our personal experience here, where we're in the Upper Valley, we've partnered, as I mentioned, with other community partners and engaged a community development fund to help provide that technical assistance. The Upper Valley Loan Fund, which is targeting raising the first $10 million from investors with the hope of leveraging that $10 million for an additional $67 million of financing. And that is dedicated to create 260 rental homes, of which 94% will be affordable. And that affordability is defined as affordable for people earning 80% of the average median income. So I think what I've seen is that locally, as you're working in, or at least what we've seen is locally working in partnerships, the plans that get developed often will dictate what that goal is and what the final product is that you're raising money to actually invest in.
I do think it's really important to realize, all property owners, very mission-oriented property owners still can't have really long-term affordability unless there is a resource that helps them recapitalize and repair that property. Like that, so sometimes there might be pushback because if they don't know where that's coming from, they still have to know in 35 years everything's going to need to be replaced, if not really in 15 years in a, or less in a family property. So there is that kind of balance too.
Great, thanks, Eileen. So we only have 2 minutes left, so maybe I can just have a concluding note or turn to each of you for any final words of wisdom or particular thoughts you'd like to leave with the audience. It seems like a lot of the folks in the chat are sort of developers, mission-driven, community-based organizations. How can they engage you, and what else should they be thinking? Eileen, you want to start? Any final words of wisdom?
Yeah, well, I mean, engaging us, obviously we do lending and investment, and you can do that through a variety of ways. We're in many communities across the country. I think you can help in this dialogue by getting corporate partners on your board, bringing exposure, that personal experience, and don't be always looking for just the housing expert. So you start building their insights.
Not just the housing expert. So Dr. Kraft, you want to go next?
I think health systems, we are here to make people healthy, and we understand that stable, affordable, safe homes are what lead to healthy or help support people optimizing their health and being able to have a healthy workforce that can come to work every day and take care of you if you God forbid should get sick. So I would say look to your health system and your community as a potential partner. We may need a lot of education. I needed a lot of education to understand. I don't even fully understand all the complexities of housing, but we have resources, we have smart people, and we often have dollars that can benefit, especially the community benefit dollars. So look to the health system as being a potential partner.
Thanks, Dr. Kraft. David, any concluding thoughts?
Yeah. Again, thank you very much to the Bipartisan Policy Center for setting this up. Please do check out the Housing Equity Fund site, and there's an application there. We are always looking for good partners to work with. So please do apply if you can.
Great, thanks, David. And I'll get the link from you and make sure we send that out after the event to all of our attendees so that they can find it. So I want to thank you all for joining me today. I can't thank you enough for sharing your insights, your experiences. I know all of our attendees, I'm sure, learned from you. So thank you. And thank you to all those watching. I want to just leave with one final plug to please, subscribe to BPC's YouTube page. So it'll update you on all our future events. We have tons of them, and head over to bbcdc.org/housing, our housing page, where you can sign up for our monthly newsletter, check out all of our work, all of our events, and all we're trying to do to address, our country's housing supply challenges. Thank you.
Thank you.